The name William Wells Brown appears in no major American literature textbook used in high schools across the country. Yet in 1853, this man published Clotel, the first novel ever written by an African American, a groundbreaking achievement that should have secured his place alongside Hawthorne and Melville in the pantheon of American letters. But there's a reason his story was buried, a reason that goes far deeper than simple neglect or oversight. Brown wasn't just a novelist. He was a fugitive slave who escaped Kentucky in 1834, and the secrets he carried about the Southern aristocracy, secrets involving Thomas Jefferson himself, the author of the Declaration of Independence, made him dangerous. For decades after his book's publication, his work was banned in multiple states. His lectures were violently disrupted by angry mobs, and his name was systematically erased from the historical record with a thoroughness that suggests deliberate intent. What did William Wells Brown know that made the establishment so afraid? What truths did he expose that were so threatening they had to be buried for over a century? And why, even today, do most Americans graduate high school without ever hearing his name? Before we continue with the story of William Wells Brown, I need you to do something. If you're hearing this and you love uncovering the hidden chapters of American history, the stories they don't teach in school, the voices that were silenced, the truths that were buried, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my fellow history seekers are, because this story belongs to all of us. Now let's go back to where it all began. The story of William Wells Brown doesn't start with triumph or literary acclaim. It starts in the suffocating heat of a Kentucky plantation in 1814, where a boy learned that his very existence was a secret someone wanted desperately to keep. Lexington, Kentucky, in the year 1814, was a city of profound contradictions, a place where the highest ideals of civilization existed side by side with the most brutal forms of human exploitation. Known throughout the region as the Athens of the West, Lexington boasted Transylvania University, one of the finest institutions of higher learning west of the Allegheny Mountains. The city's streets were lined with elegant Federal-style homes, their columns gleaming white in the summer sun. Lawyers, doctors, and merchants conducted business in well-appointed offices. Cultural societies met to discuss philosophy and literature. To the casual observer, Lexington appeared to be a beacon of enlightenment on the frontier. But beneath this veneer of civilization lay an economy built entirely on human bondage. The wealth that paid for those elegant homes, that funded the university, that allowed the merchants to prosper, all of it flowed from hemp and tobacco, and from the labor of thousands of enslaved people who worked the surrounding plantations from dawn until well past dusk. The city was also a major hub for the domestic slave trade, with auction houses where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, their families torn apart, their futures determined by the highest bidder. It was into this world of contradictions that William was born, sometime in the spring of 1814, on a plantation several miles outside of Lexington. His mother was a woman named Elizabeth, who had been enslaved since birth. She was intelligent and resourceful, with a quiet strength that would later be reflected in her son. She worked in the main house of the plantation, which belonged to a physician named Dr. John Young. William's father was white, a relative of Dr. Young, though the exact relationship was never openly acknowledged. This was not uncommon in the slave-holding South. Throughout the region, the children of such unions lived in a peculiar and painful limbo, enslaved by law, yet bearing the features and sometimes even the mannerisms of the men who owned them. William's skin was lighter than his mother's, his features sharper, his hair less tightly curled. These physical markers set him apart from the other enslaved children on the plantation, and that difference would shape every moment of his life. From his earliest memories, William was aware of the fundamental truth of his existence. He was property. He could be sold, traded, or given away at any moment at the whim of his owner. He had no legal rights, no claim to his own body, no future beyond what Dr. Young decided for him. The law did not recognize him as a person, but as a thing, chattel, no different in the eyes of the law than a horse or a plow. And yet, William also understood something else, something he saw in the furtive glances between his mother and certain members of the young family, something whispered in the slave quarters late at night when the white folks were asleep. There were secrets in that house, secrets about bloodlines and paternity, secrets about who his father really was and why Dr. Young sometimes looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, not quite guilt, not quite recognition, but something in between. Elizabeth never spoke openly about William's father. It was too dangerous, but she made sure her son understood that he was different, that he had to be careful, that he had to watch and learn and never ever draw too much attention to himself. She taught him to read the moods of white people, to anticipate their needs, to make himself useful without making himself threatening. These were survival skills, and she drilled them into him from the time he could walk. As a young child, William was assigned light duties around the plantation. He fetched water from the well, ran errands between the main house and the outbuildings, and sometimes served at table when Dr. Young had guests. He was bright and observant, with a quick mind that absorbed everything around him. He watched how the white people spoke to each other, how they conducted business, how they made decisions. He listened to their conversations about politics and philosophy, about the rights of man and the nature of liberty. And he noticed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of it all, these men who spoke so eloquently about freedom while holding other human beings in chains. Dr. Young was not the cruelest of masters. He did not beat his slaves without cause, and he provided adequate food and shelter. But he was still a master, and the system he upheld was one of absolute control. William saw enslaved people whipped for small infractions, for being late to work, for talking back, for trying to learn to read. He saw families separated when Dr. Young sold someone to pay off a debt. He saw the constant grinding fear that permeated life in the quarters, the knowledge that at any moment everything could be taken away. In 1816, when William was about 2 years old, Dr. Young made a decision that would change the course of William's life. The doctor decided to move his household to Missouri, a territory on the edge of the American frontier. Missouri was being rapidly settled by white Americans, many of them from Kentucky and other slave states, and they were bringing the institution of slavery with them. Dr. Young saw opportunity there. New land, new patients, new sources of income. The journey from Kentucky to Missouri was long and arduous. William was too young to remember much of it, but his mother would later tell him about the weeks spent traveling by wagon and flatboat, the camps along the way, the river crossings. For the enslaved people making the journey, it was a time of profound anxiety. They were being taken further from everything they knew, deeper into a wilderness where escape would be even more difficult, where the chances of ever seeing family members left behind would become vanishingly small. Dr. Young settled his family in St. Charles County, Missouri, not far from St. Louis. The area was still relatively wild, with dense forests and few roads. The work of establishing a new plantation was backbreaking. Trees had to be cleared, fields had to be plowed, buildings had to be constructed. William, though still a child, was put to work alongside the others. He learned what it meant to labor until his hands bled, to fall asleep the moment his head touched the rough pallet in the slave quarters, to wake before dawn and do it all again. As William grew older, his duties changed. By the time he was 7 or 8, he was working in the fields during planting and harvest seasons and serving in the house at other times. He was strong for his age, and Dr. Young began to hire him out to neighbors who needed extra labor. This was common practice among slave owners. It allowed them to profit from their human property, even when they didn't have enough work to keep everyone busy on their own land. It was during these years that William began to truly understand the nature of slavery. He saw it not just as a system of labor, but as a system of total domination, one designed to break the spirit as well as the body. He saw enslaved people who had given up hope, who moved through their days like ghosts, their eyes empty. He saw others who maintained a spark of defiance, who found small ways to resist, working slowly when the overseer wasn't watching, breaking tools accidentally, singing songs with hidden meanings. and he saw what happened to those who resisted too openly. The whip, the stocks, the sale to the Deep South, which was spoken of in the quarters with the same dread that others might speak of death itself. William's mother, Elizabeth, remained a constant presence in his life during these years. She was his anchor, his source of strength. She told him stories about her own childhood, about the family members she had been separated from when she was sold to Dr. Young. She taught him to hold on to his humanity, to never let the system convince him that he was less than human. And she taught him something else, something dangerous. She taught him that slavery was wrong, that it was a moral abomination, that the white people who upheld it were the ones who should be ashamed, not the enslaved. This was radical knowledge, and Elizabeth was careful about when and how she shared it. But she wanted her son to know the truth, even if that truth was dangerous. She wanted him to understand that the chains that bound him were not natural or inevitable, but were forged by human hands, and could be broken by human hands. By the time William reached his teenage years, he had grown into a strong, capable young man. He was tall and well-built, with the light skin and sharp features that marked him as mixed race. He was also intelligent and articulate, with a way of speaking that sometimes made white people uncomfortable. He had learned to read, though he kept this knowledge hidden. Literacy was forbidden to the enslaved in Missouri, as it was throughout the South, and the penalties for being caught with a book were severe. But William had managed to learn anyway, picking up scraps of knowledge here and there, studying in secret whenever he could. In 1827, when William was about 13 years old, Dr. Young made another decision that would profoundly affect William's life. The doctor sold him to a man named Samuel Willie, a merchant and tavern keeper in St. Louis. The sale was conducted without warning, without any chance for William to say goodbye to his mother. One day he was on the plantation, and the next he was being taken to the city, his future once again determined by someone else's decision. The separation from his mother was devastating. Elizabeth had been the one constant in William's life, the person who had taught him, protected him, loved him. Now she was gone, and William had no idea if he would ever see her again. The pain of that separation would stay with him for the rest of his life, and it would later inform his writing about the destruction of enslaved families. St. Louis in 1827 was a city in the midst of transformation. It sat on the western bank of the Mississippi River, at the confluence with the Missouri River, and it was rapidly becoming one of the most important commercial centers in the American West. Steamboats lined the docks, their smokestacks belching black smoke into the sky. The levee was crowded with workers loading and unloading cargo, bales of cotton, barrels of flour, crates of manufactured goods from the east. The streets were filled with a diverse mix of people: French fur traders, American merchants, German immigrants, free black people, and enslaved people like William. For William, St. Louis was a revelation. On the plantation, his world had been small and circumscribed. But here, the city opened up new possibilities, new ways of seeing. He saw free black people for the first time, men and women who walked the streets without chains, who earned wages, who owned their own lives. Some of them were barbers or laundresses, others worked on the docks or in shops. They lived in a precarious freedom, always at risk of being kidnapped and sold into slavery, but they were free nonetheless. William's new owner, Samuel Willie, was a hard man with a quick temper and a fondness for whiskey. He ran a tavern near the waterfront, a rough establishment that catered to riverboat men and laborers. William's job was to serve drinks, clean up and run errands. The work was demanding, and Willie was quick to use his fists when he was displeased. William learned to move quickly, to anticipate Willie's moods, to make himself as invisible as possible. But working in the tavern also gave William access to information. He heard the riverboat men talk about their travels up and down the Mississippi, about the cities they had seen, about the free states to the north. He heard about the Underground Railroad, a network of people who helped fugitive slaves escape to freedom. He heard about abolitionists in the North who were fighting to end slavery, and he began, for the first time, to seriously contemplate escape. The idea was terrifying. The penalties for running away were severe: whipping, branding, sale to the Deep South. Slave catchers patrolled the roads and rivers, and they were paid handsomely for every fugitive they captured. The journey to freedom would be long and dangerous, through territory where a black man traveling alone would immediately be suspect. And even if William made it to a free state, he would still be a fugitive, subject to capture and return under the Fugitive Slave Act. But the alternative, spending the rest of his life in bondage, never knowing freedom, never having control over his own destiny, was unbearable. William began to plan, carefully and methodically. He saved scraps of food. He studied maps when he could get his hands on them. He listened to every conversation about the geography of the region, about the roads and rivers, about the locations of free states. In the winter of 1829, William's life took an even darker turn. Samuel Willie, facing financial difficulties, hired William out to a man named James Walker. Walker was a slave trader, one of the most despised professions in a society that already accepted slavery. Even many slave owners looked down on slave traders, seeing them as vultures who profited from human misery. But Walker didn't care about respectability. He cared about profit. Walker's business model was simple and brutal. He would travel through Kentucky and Missouri, purchasing enslaved people from owners who needed cash or who wanted to get rid of troublesome slaves. He would then transport these people down the Mississippi River to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, where the demand for labor was insatiable and the prices were higher. The journey was known in the slave quarters as being sold down the river, and it was spoken of with absolute dread. The cotton plantations of the Deep South were notorious for their brutality, their high mortality rates, their utter disregard for human life. William's job was to help Walker manage his human cargo. It was a position that filled him with shame and rage. He was complicit in the suffering of others, even though he himself was enslaved and had no choice in the matter. He saw things during those months that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Walker would gather groups of enslaved people, sometimes as many as 30 or 40 at a time, and march them to the riverbank. The captives were chained together in coffles, long lines of people shackled at the wrists and ankles. They walked for miles, their feet bleeding, their bodies exhausted. Those who couldn't keep up were whipped. Those who collapsed were dragged. At the riverbank, they were loaded onto flatboats for the journey downriver. The boats were crowded and filthy, with barely enough room for everyone to sit. The captives were exposed to the elements, the scorching sun during the day, the cold and damp at night. They were given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive until they could be sold. Many fell ill with dysentery or fever. Some died during the journey, and their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony, disappearing into the muddy waters of the Mississippi. William was forced to witness all of this. He helped chain the captives. He helped load them onto the boats. He helped guard them during the journey, making sure no one tried to escape. And every moment of it tore at his soul. He saw mothers separated from their children, the children screaming as they were pulled away, the mothers collapsing in grief. He saw husbands and wives torn apart, their pleas for mercy ignored. He saw young women who knew what awaited them on the plantations. Not just hard labor, but sexual exploitation at the hands of overseers and owners. He saw men who had been skilled craftsmen reduced to field hands, their years of training and experience rendered worthless. And he saw the slave markets of New Orleans, where human beings were displayed on auction blocks like livestock. The auctioneers would make the captives strip to their undergarments so that buyers could inspect their bodies, checking their teeth, their muscles, their scars. Women were subjected to particularly degrading examinations. The buyers would poke and prod, asking questions about health and work history, negotiating prices as if they were buying horses or cattle. On one particular trip in the spring of 1830, Walker purchased a young woman named Eliza. She was in her early 20s. with dark skin and intelligent eyes that held a quiet dignity despite her circumstances. She had been sold away from her family in Virginia and was being transported to New Orleans, where she would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. William spoke to Eliza during the journey, offering what small comfort he could. It was dangerous. Walker didn't like his assistants fraternizing with the merchandise, but William couldn't help himself. There was something about Eliza that reminded him of his mother, a strength and resilience that refused to be broken. Eliza told him about her life before. She had grown up on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, where she had worked in the main house. The mistress's daughter, a girl about Eliza's age, had secretly taught her to read, sharing books and lessons when no one else was around. It was an act of kindness that could have gotten them both severely punished, but the girl had done it anyway, believing it was the right thing to do. Eliza had been happy as an enslaved person could be. She had friends in the quarters, a community that supported each other. She had even fallen in love with a young man named Samuel, and they had talked about jumping the broom, the informal marriage ceremony that enslaved people used since they were not allowed to legally marry. But then the master had died, and his estate had to be settled. Eliza was sold to pay off debts. She was taken from Virginia in chains, never given a chance to say goodbye to Samuel or her friends, or the mistress's daughter who had taught her to read. She had been sold to a trader in Kentucky, and then sold again to Walker, and now she was being taken to New Orleans, further and further from everything she had ever known. As Eliza told her story, William saw tears in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She held herself with a dignity that was almost painful to witness. She was intelligent, articulate, and full of life, yet she was being treated like an animal, her humanity denied at every turn. When they reached New Orleans, Eliza was sold to a plantation owner from Mississippi. William watched as she was led away, her head held high despite the chains on her wrists. He never saw her again, but he never forgot her. She became, in his mind, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. A system that reduced human beings to commodities, that destroyed families, that crushed hope and love and dignity under the weight of profit and power. It was after that trip that William made his decision. He would escape. He would risk everything. His life, his safety, the possibility of ever seeing his mother again, for a chance at freedom. He couldn't continue to be complicit in the suffering of others. He couldn't continue to live as property. He had to try, even if the attempt cost him his life. William's first attempt to escape came in the fall of 1833. By this time, he was no longer working for James Walker. Samuel Willie had hired him out to a steamboat captain who needed an extra hand for a journey up the Ohio River. The steamboat was a magnificent vessel, one of the new side-wheelers that were revolutionizing river travel. It had multiple decks, a grand saloon with chandeliers, and private cabins for wealthy passengers. William's job was to work in the engine room, shoveling coal into the furnaces that powered the steam engines. The work was hot, dirty, and exhausting, but William didn't mind. The steamboat traveled to Cincinnati, Ohio, a free state just across the river from Kentucky. William had heard about Cincinnati from other enslaved people. It was known as a haven for fugitives, with a large free black community and active abolitionist networks. If he could just get off the boat and disappear into the city, he might have a chance. William planned his escape carefully. He waited until the steamboat was docked in Cincinnati, until the crew was busy unloading cargo and the passengers were disembarking. Then, in the confusion, he simply walked away. He left the boat, walked up the levee, and disappeared into the streets of the city. For a few hours, William felt something he had never felt before: freedom. He walked through the streets of Cincinnati, marveling at the sight of black people who were free, who walked with their heads held high, who were not afraid. He saw black-owned businesses, black churches, black families living their lives without the constant threat of violence and separation, but William's freedom was short-lived. He had no money, No contacts, no plan beyond getting off the boat. And he was conspicuous, a young black man with no papers, no explanation for his presence in the city. Within hours, he was spotted by slave catchers, professional bounty hunters who made their living capturing fugitive slaves and returning them to their owners for a reward. The slave catchers grabbed William on a street corner, ignoring his protests, ignoring the pleas of free black people who tried to intervene. They dragged him to a jail where fugitive slaves were held, and they sent word to Samuel Willie that his property had been recovered. Willie came to Cincinnati to retrieve William, and the journey back to St. Louis was a nightmare. Willie was furious, not just because William had tried to escape, but because the attempt had cost him time and money. He had to pay the slave catchers their reward, and he had to pay for his own travel expenses. He made it clear that William would pay for this transgression. When they returned to St. Louis, Willie had William whipped. The punishment was carried out in the yard behind the tavern, where other enslaved people were forced to watch as a warning. William was stripped to the waist and tied to a post. The overseer used a leather whip, bringing it down again and again across William's back, each stroke leaving a bloody welt. William tried not to cry out, tried to maintain his dignity, but the pain was overwhelming. By the time it was over, his back was a mass of torn flesh, and he could barely stand. The physical pain was terrible, but the psychological impact was worse. William had tasted freedom, however briefly, and now it had been snatched away. He had been caught, punished, humiliated. The scars on his back would heal, but the memory of that whipping would stay with him forever. But the punishment didn't break William's spirit. If anything, it hardened his resolve. He had tried to escape and failed, but that didn't mean he would stop trying. It just meant he needed a better plan. Over the next year, William bided his time. He worked for Samuel Willie, doing whatever was asked of him, keeping his head down, giving no indication that he was planning anything. But inside, he was always thinking, always planning, always looking for an opportunity. He studied the geography of the region more carefully. He learned which roads led north, which rivers could be crossed, which towns had active abolitionist networks. He listened to every conversation, absorbed every piece of information that might be useful. He saved scraps of food, hiding them away for the journey he knew he would eventually make. He also thought about his mother, Elizabeth. He had not seen her since he was sold to Samuel Willie, and he had no idea where she was, or if she was even still alive. The thought of never seeing her again was painful, but William knew that if he stayed enslaved, he would never have the power to find her, to help her, to give her the life she deserved. The only way he could ever hope to reunite with his mother was to first secure his own freedom. By late 1833, William was ready to try again. This time, he would be smarter, more careful. He would not make the same mistakes. On the first day of January, 1834, William made his move. It was a bitterly cold morning, with frost covering the ground and a sharp wind blowing off the Mississippi River. The city was quiet, with most people still recovering from New Year's celebrations the night before. Samuel Willie had sent William on an errand to deliver a message to a merchant on the other side of town. It was the opportunity William had been waiting for. Instead of delivering the message, William simply kept walking. He walked north, out of the city, toward the free state of Illinois. He had no coat, no food, no money. All he had was his determination and the knowledge that if he was caught this time, the punishment would be far worse than a whipping. The journey was brutal. The temperature was well below freezing, and William had only the thin clothes he was wearing. His feet, clad in worn shoes with holes in the soles, quickly became numb. He walked through fields and forests, avoiding roads where he might be spotted. He drank from frozen streams, breaking through the ice to get to the water beneath. He ate whatever he could find, berries, roots, nothing that provided much sustenance. For 3 days, William traveled through the frozen countryside. He slept in barns when he could find them, huddled in the hay for warmth. He slept in the open when he couldn't, shivering through the long nights, wondering if he would freeze to death before morning. Every sound made him jump. The crack of a branch, the howl of a wolf, the distant sound of dogs. He knew that slave catchers used bloodhounds to track fugitives, and the thought of being torn apart by dogs terrified him. But William kept moving. He had come too far to turn back now. He had risked too much. He would rather die in the attempt than return to slavery. On the third day, half frozen and delirious with hunger and exhaustion, William reached the town of Quincy, Illinois. He was free, legally at least. Illinois was a free state and slavery was prohibited by law. But William knew that the law meant little when it came to fugitive slaves. Slave catchers operated in Illinois just as they did in Missouri, and they didn't care much about legal niceties. They would capture him if they could, drag him back across the river, and collect their reward. William needed help, but he didn't know where to turn. He was a stranger in Quincy, with no contacts, no resources. He wandered the streets, trying to stay out of sight, trying to figure out his next move. It was then that he encountered a man who would change his life forever. The man's name was Wells Brown, and he was a Quaker who ran a small farm outside of Quincy. Wells Brown was in town that morning to purchase supplies, and he noticed William immediately. A young black man, shivering in the cold, with the unmistakable look of a fugitive slave. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face gaunt with hunger, his eyes darting nervously at every passerby. Wells Brown had seen that look before. He was an abolitionist, part of a network of people who believed that slavery was a moral abomination, and who were willing to risk their own safety to help fugitive slaves reach freedom. The Quakers, with their belief in the equality of all people before God, were among the most active participants in what would later be called the Underground Railroad. Wells Brown approached William carefully, not wanting to startle him. He spoke in a low, calm voice, asking if William needed help. William was wary at first. He had learned not to trust white people, had learned that kindness could be a trap. But there was something in Wells Brown's eyes, a genuine compassion, that made William take a chance. "I'm running," William said simply, "from Missouri. I need to get further north." Wells Brown nodded. He didn't ask for details, didn't demand explanations. He simply said, "Come with me." Wells Brown took William to his farm, a modest property with a small house, a barn, and fields that were dormant in the winter. He brought William into the house, where his wife had a fire burning in the hearth. She took one look at William and immediately set about preparing food, hot soup, fresh bread, things that William had not tasted in days. As William ate, Wells Brown explained the situation. Quincy was not safe for fugitive slaves. There were slave catchers in the area, and they were actively searching for runaways. William would need to move on, to continue north to Chicago or even into Canada, where he would be truly beyond the reach of American slave law. But first, William needed to rest and recover his strength. Wells Brown offered to hide him on the farm for a few days to give him time to heal from his ordeal. William accepted gratefully. Over the next few days, as William recovered in the warmth and safety of the Brown household, he and Wells Brown had many conversations. Wells Brown wanted to understand William's story, to hear firsthand about the realities of slavery. William, for his part, was eager to talk. For years he had kept his thoughts and feelings bottled up inside, afraid to express them for fear of punishment. Now, for the first time, he could speak freely. William told Wells Brown about his childhood on the plantation in Kentucky, about the move to Missouri, about his mother and the pain of being separated from her. He told him about working for James Walker, about the horrors of the slave trade, about Eliza and the countless others whose lives had been destroyed by the system. He told him about his first failed escape attempt, about the whipping, about the scars on his back that would never fully heal. Wells Brown listened to all of this with a mixture of sadness and anger. He had always opposed slavery on moral grounds, but hearing William's story brought the reality of it into sharp focus. This was not an abstract political issue. This was about real people, real suffering, real injustice. Wells Brown also shared his own story, He explained that he was part of a network of abolitionists who were working to end slavery through both legal and extra-legal means. Some focused on political action, lobbying for laws that would restrict or abolish slavery. Others focused on direct action, helping fugitive slaves escape to freedom. Wells Brown was part of the latter group. He explained how the network operated. There were safe houses along routes leading north, places where fugitive slaves could hide and rest. There were conductors who would guide them from one safe house to the next. There were sympathetic ship captains who would smuggle fugitives across the Great Lakes into Canada. It was dangerous work. Those caught helping fugitive slaves could be fined, imprisoned, or even killed by angry mobs. But Wells Brown and others like him believed it was their moral duty. After several days, when William had regained his strength, Wells Brown helped him prepare for the next leg of his journey. He gave William warm clothes, food for the road, and money, a precious commodity that William had never possessed before. He also gave William a letter of introduction to other abolitionists further north, people who could provide additional help. But perhaps most importantly, Wells Brown gave William something intangible: hope. He showed William that there were white people who believed in justice, who were willing to risk their own safety to help others, who saw enslaved people not as property, but as human beings deserving of freedom and dignity. When it was time for William to leave, Wells Brown walked with him to the edge of the farm. The two men shook hands, and Wells Brown said something that William would never forget. "You are a free man now. Live like one." William continued his journey north, traveling through Illinois and into Wisconsin. The journey was still dangerous, but it was easier now that he had resources and contacts. He stayed at safe houses along the way, guided by conductors who knew the routes and the risks. He traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day, always alert for the sound of pursuing slave catchers. Finally, after weeks of travel, William crossed into Canada. He took a ferry across Lake Erie, and when he stepped onto Canadian soil, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was truly free now. The laws of the United States no longer applied to him. He could not be captured and returned to slavery. He was his own man. But freedom, William quickly discovered, was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning. In Canada, William settled in the town of St. Catharines, a community in the Niagara region that had a significant population of fugitive slaves. The town was a refuge, a place where people who had escaped bondage could start new lives. But starting over was not easy. William had no money, no possessions, no trade skills that were immediately marketable. He worked odd jobs, loading cargo on the docks, chopping wood, doing whatever manual labor he could find. The pay was low and the work was hard, but it was his work. He was earning wages for his own labor, not enriching a master. That made all the difference. But William wanted more than just survival. He wanted to educate himself, to make up for the years of learning that had been stolen from him. He had learned to read as a child, but his education had been rudimentary at best. Now, with time and freedom, he set about educating himself in earnest. He spent every spare penny on books. He read history, philosophy, literature. He read the speeches of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and the writings of former slaves like Frederick Douglass. He studied grammar and rhetoric, teaching himself to write with clarity and power. He read late into the night by candlelight, his mind hungry for knowledge. William also began to write himself. At first his writings were simple, letters to other fugitive slaves, essays about his experiences, short accounts of life in bondage. But he had a gift for language, a way of capturing the horror and humanity of slavery in words that moved people. His writing was raw and honest, filled with vivid details and emotional truth. In 1836, William moved to Buffalo, New York, a bustling city on the American side of the border. Buffalo was a hub of abolitionist activity, and William was drawn to the movement. He began attending meetings of the local anti-slavery society, where he met other activists who were working to end slavery through political action, moral persuasion, and direct assistance to fugitive slaves. It was in Buffalo that William first spoke publicly about his experiences. He was invited to address a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society, and he stood before a crowd of white abolitionists and told them his story. He spoke about his childhood in slavery, about his mother, about the slave trade, about his escape. He spoke with passion and eloquence, and when he finished, the audience was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. That speech changed William's life. He discovered that he had a talent for public speaking, that he could move audiences with his words, that his story had power. The abolitionists in Buffalo recognized this talent and encouraged him to speak more widely. They arranged for him to give lectures in other cities, to share his story with larger audiences. Over the next few years, William became one of the most sought-after speakers in the abolitionist movement. He traveled throughout New York, Pennsylvania, and New England, speaking at churches, town halls, and outdoor gatherings. He spoke to audiences of hundreds, sometimes thousands. He shared his experiences in slavery, but he also spoke about the broader moral and political issues, about the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty while holding millions in chains, about the economic interest that sustained slavery, about the need for immediate abolition. William's speeches were powerful because they were personal. He didn't speak in abstractions or generalizations. He spoke about real people, his mother, Eliza, the countless others he had seen bought and sold. He spoke about the pain of separation, the brutality of the whip, the constant fear that permeated life in bondage. He made slavery real for audiences who had never experienced it, who had never seen it up close. But speaking publicly also made William a target. Pro-slavery forces were active in the North as well as the South, and they did not appreciate William's message. His lectures were sometimes disrupted by angry mobs who threw rotten vegetables, shouted insults, and even threatened violence. William was physically attacked on more than one occasion, beaten by thugs who wanted to silence him. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made William's situation even more precarious. The law required that fugitive slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were captured in free states. It also imposed penalties on anyone who helped fugitive slaves, and it allowed slave catchers to operate with impunity throughout the North. William was now a wanted man, with a price on his head. His former owner, Samuel Willie, had never given up the search for him, and the new law gave Willie legal tools to reclaim his property. In 1849, fearing for his safety, William made the difficult decision to leave the United States. He traveled to England, where slavery had been abolished in 1833, and where he would be beyond the reach of American slave catchers. England was also a center of abolitionist activity, and William hoped to continue his work there. In England, William was welcomed by the British abolitionist movement. He gave lectures throughout the country, speaking to audiences who were horrified by his accounts of American slavery. He met prominent abolitionists, intellectuals, and politicians. He was treated with a respect and dignity that he had never experienced in America, where even free black people were subjected to discrimination and violence. It was in England that William began work on his most ambitious project, a novel that would expose the full horror of American slavery to the world. The novel that William Wells Brown wrote was unlike anything that had been published before. It was called Clotel, or The President's Daughter, a narrative of slave life in the United States, and it was published in London in December 1853. It was the first novel ever written by an African American, a groundbreaking achievement that should have secured William's place in literary history. But Clotel was more than just a literary milestone. It was a political bombshell. The novel told the story of Clotel, a young woman who was the daughter of Thomas Jefferson, and an enslaved woman named Currer. The story followed Clotel and her sister Althesa as they were sold into slavery, despite their connection to one of America's founding fathers. The novel depicted the brutal realities of slavery, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the separation of families, the violence and degradation that were inherent to the system. It also exposed the profound hypocrisy at the heart of American democracy. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, The man who had written that all men are created equal had fathered children with an enslaved woman and then allowed those children to be sold into bondage. The story of Jefferson and Sally Hemings was not new. Rumors about their relationship had circulated since the early 1800s, when a journalist named James Callender had published allegations about Jefferson's involvement with an enslaved woman. But the rumors had always been denied by Jefferson's defenders, dismissed as political slander. No one had dared to make the story the centerpiece of a work of fiction, to present it as truth, to use it as a lens through which to examine the moral bankruptcy of American slavery. William did exactly that. He based his novel on the rumors about Jefferson and Hemings, but he also drew on his own experiences and the stories he had heard from other fugitive slaves. The result was a powerful, searing indictment of American slavery and American hypocrisy. Clotel was structured as a melodrama, with elements of romance, tragedy, and adventure. The plot followed Clotel through a series of harrowing experiences. She was sold away from her mother, forced into a relationship with a white man who promised to free her, but then abandoned her, separated from her own daughter, and ultimately driven to desperation. In the novel's climactic scene, Clotel, pursued by slave catchers, threw herself into the Potomac River within sight of the Capitol building, choosing death over a return to slavery. The symbolism was unmistakable. Clotel died in the shadow of the nation's capital, the seat of a government that proclaimed liberty while upholding slavery. Her death was a direct indictment of American hypocrisy, a powerful image that William hoped would shock readers into recognizing the moral horror of slavery. The novel also included detailed descriptions of the domestic slave trade, the auction blocks, the coffles of chained captives marching south. William drew on his own experiences working for James Walker, and he spared no detail in depicting the brutality of the trade. He wrote about mothers torn from their children, about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, about the casual cruelty of slave traders who saw human beings as nothing more than merchandise. Clotel was published in England to significant acclaim. British reviewers praised the novel for its emotional power and its unflinching portrayal of slavery. British abolitionists used the book as evidence in their campaigns to pressure the United States to end slavery. The novel was translated into multiple languages and distributed throughout Europe. But in the United States, the reaction was very different. Southern newspapers denounced Clotel as lies and slander. They attacked William personally, calling him a liar, a troublemaker, a traitor to his race. They claimed that the novel was a work of fiction designed to inflame passions and incite rebellion. They insisted that slavery was a benign institution, that enslaved people were well treated and content, that the horrors depicted in Clotel were exaggerations or outright fabrications. Northern newspapers were more divided. Some praised the novel for its courage and its moral clarity. Others criticized it as inflammatory and dangerous, arguing that it would only increase tensions between North and South. Many reviewers focused on the allegations about Thomas Jefferson, which they found deeply uncomfortable. Jefferson was a national icon, a founding father, a symbol of American ideals. The idea that he had fathered children with an enslaved woman and then allowed them to be sold was too damaging to the national mythology to be easily accepted. The novel was banned in several southern states, and booksellers who tried to sell it were threatened with violence. William himself received death threats. Letters arrived at his residence in England, some containing graphic descriptions of what would happen to him if he ever returned to the United States. Pro-slavery activists in England disrupted his lectures, shouting him down, throwing objects, trying to intimidate him into silence. But William refused to be silenced. He continued to speak, to write, to fight. He published more books, a travel narrative called 3 Years in Europe, a play called The Escape, or A Leap for Freedom, a history of black soldiers in the American Revolution called The Negro in the American Rebellion. He became one of the most prominent black intellectuals of his time, a voice that could not be ignored. In 1854, British abolitionists raised money to purchase William's freedom from Samuel Wheely. The transaction was a legal formality. William was already free in any meaningful sense, but it meant that he could return to the United States without fear of being captured and re-enslaved. William returned to America in 1854, and he immediately resumed his work as a lecturer and writer. During the Civil War, William worked as a recruiter for black soldiers, helping to organize regiments that would fight for the Union and for the freedom of enslaved people. He also worked as a physician, using medical knowledge he had acquired over the years to treat wounded soldiers. After the war, he continued to write and speak, advocating for the rights of newly freed black Americans. But even as William's fame grew, there were forces working to erase him from history. The story he had told in Clotel, the story of Jefferson and his enslaved children, the story of the brutal realities of slavery, was too uncomfortable, too damaging to the national narrative. As the nation tried to reconcile after the Civil War, as North and South sought to move forward, uncomfortable truths were quietly buried. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States entered a period known as Reconstruction. For a brief time, it seemed as though the nation might truly live up to its founding ideals. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people born in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Black Americans seized these opportunities. They voted, ran for office, and won elections. Black men served in Congress, in state legislatures as judges and sheriffs. Black communities built schools, churches, and businesses. For a moment, it seemed as though the promise of freedom might actually be fulfilled. But the backlash was swift and brutal. White supremacists in the South organized violent campaigns to restore white dominance. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, burning homes, lynching black men, driving black voters away from the polls. Northern support for Reconstruction waned as white Americans grew tired of the Negro question and wanted to move on. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over, and the South was left to implement a new system of racial control: Jim Crow. Under Jim Crow, black Americans were systematically disenfranchised, segregated, and subjected to violence and discrimination. The gains of Reconstruction were rolled back, and part of this process involved controlling the narrative about slavery and the Civil War. History was rewritten to downplay the horrors of slavery and to romanticize the Old South. Textbooks taught that slavery had been a benign institution, that enslaved people had been happy and well cared for, that the Civil War had been about states' rights rather than slavery. The contributions of black Americans, as soldiers, as activists, as writers and intellectuals, were systematically erased from the historical record. William Wells Brown was one of the victims of this erasure. His books went out of print. His name disappeared from literary anthologies and history textbooks. The novel that should have secured his place in American literature, Clotel, the first novel by an African American, was forgotten. Generations of American students learned about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, but not about William Wells Brown's Clotel. They learned about Frederick Douglass, but not about the man who had written the first African American novel, who had worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, who had lectured across 2 continents, who had fought for freedom his entire life. Why was William Wells Brown erased? The answer is complex, but it comes down to power and narrative control. William Wells Brown was dangerous because he told the truth. He exposed the brutal realities of slavery in vivid, unflinching detail. He implicated Thomas Jefferson, one of the nation's founding fathers, in the system of slavery. He proved, through his own life and achievements, that the racist ideologies used to justify slavery were lies. He was intelligent, articulate, accomplished, living proof that black people were not inherently inferior, that the difference between the enslaved and the free was not one of ability, but of opportunity, and that truth was threatening. For the system of slavery to function, it required a lie that black people were suited for bondage, that they were incapable of self-governance, that they were fundamentally different from white people. William Wells Brown shattered that lie. And even after slavery ended, that lie remained useful to those who wanted to maintain white supremacy through other means. So William Wells Brown was erased. His books were allowed to go out of print. His name was left out of textbooks. His achievements were forgotten. It was a deliberate act of historical amnesia, designed to maintain a particular narrative about American history, a narrative that minimized the horrors of slavery, that celebrated the Founding Fathers without acknowledging their complicity in human bondage, that erased the contributions of Black Americans. William Wells Brown died in 1884, at the age of 70. He had lived an extraordinary life, from enslaved child to fugitive to internationally renowned author and activist. He had written multiple books, given hundreds of lectures, helped dozens of people escape slavery. He had fought for freedom and justice his entire life, but by the time he died, he was already being forgotten. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars began to rediscover William Wells Brown. Historians and literary critics, digging through archives and old newspapers, found his books, his letters, his speeches. They pieced together his story and began to restore his place in American history. Today, Clotel is recognized as a landmark work of American literature. It's taught in universities, analyzed in scholarly journals, celebrated as a pioneering achievement. Scholars have confirmed that the rumors about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were true. DNA evidence has proven that Jefferson fathered at least one of Hemings's children, and possibly all 6. The story that William Wells Brown told in Clotel, the story that was dismissed as slander and lies, was true. But even today, William Wells Brown is not widely known. Most Americans have never heard of him. Most high school students never encounter his work. He remains a footnote in American history when he should be a central figure. The erasure of William Wells Brown is not just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder of how history is shaped, how narratives are controlled, how inconvenient truths are buried. It's a reminder that the stories we tell about the past have power. Power to inspire, to educate, to challenge, to change. William Wells Brown spent his life fighting for freedom, not just his own, but for all people held in bondage. He risked everything to escape slavery, and then he risked everything again to tell the truth about it. He wrote books that exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty while denying it to millions. He gave voice to the voiceless, and he refused to be silenced. And yet, for more than a century, his voice was silenced anyway, not by chains, but by the deliberate erasure of his legacy. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: what other stories have been buried? What other voices have been silenced? What other truths are we not being told? History is not a fixed, objective record of the past. It's a narrative constructed by people with particular perspectives and particular interests. And those who control the narrative have the power to shape how we understand the past, how we see the present, and how we imagine the future. William Wells Brown's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It's a story of courage, determination, and hope. But it's also a warning. It's a warning about the fragility of memory, about how easily history can be rewritten, about how the powerful will always try to control the narrative. But it's also a call to action, because the only way to prevent the erasure of history is to remember it, to tell it, to pass it on. William Wells Brown's story survived because people refused to let it die. Scholars dug through archives, pieced together fragments, brought his story back to light. And now it's our responsibility to make sure it's never forgotten again. William Wells Brown deserves a place in every American literature classroom. He deserves to be remembered alongside Hawthorne and Melville and Stowe. He deserves to be recognized as a pioneer, as a truth-teller, as a fighter for justice. His story is part of American history, and American history belongs to all of us. What do you think of this story? Do you believe William Wells Brown deserves a place in every American literature classroom? Do you think there are other historical figures whose stories have been deliberately erased? Leave your comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into hidden American history and want more stories like this, stories about the people and events that shaped our nation but were left out of the textbooks, then subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a video, and share this with someone who loves uncovering the truth. History is not just about the past, it's about understanding who we are and who we can become. See you in the next video.